All right, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning here in Arizona. My name is Beatrice Dupuy. I'm professor in the departments of French and Italian and Public and Applied Humanities here at the University of Arizona, and I'm one of the co-directors of Circle. Before we get started with this webinar, I have a few announcements that I would like to make. So Circle is housed in the College of Humanities at the University of Arizona and is one of 16 language resource centers funded by the US Department of Education. And on this slide, you have the web link to Circle's website and the link to the Language Resource Center's general website, where you can find out about the work we all do and access our free resources. On this slide, we have included the theme of our upcoming 8th Intercultural Competence Conference, which will be held in late January 2022. And the theme is Decentering Mobility in Intercultural Education, Engagement, Equity, and Access. The call for papers will be coming very soon. We're expected either later this year or early next. Also included on this slide are the 2 webinar series that we are preparing for spring 2021, Multimodal Literacies in the L2 Classroom and Intercultural Communication in the L2 Classroom. We're still working on our speaker lineup, but hope to have all this in place before the semester ends or shortly after the beginning of the spring semester. The presenter of today's webinar is Dr. Heather Willis Allen. Heather is Associate Professor of French in the Department of French and Italian at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a core faculty member of our university's second language acquisition doctoral program. She teaches undergraduate French courses and graduate courses in applied linguistics and serves as course chair for elementary French 1 and 2 and intermediate French 1 in our department. Her research has appeared in the ADFL Bulletin, Foreign Language Annals, the French Review, L2 Journal, and the Model Language Journal, just to name a few. Her collaborative projects have included a multiliteracies framework for collegiate foreign language teaching, co-authored with Kate Paisani and myself, and published in 2016. And then Alliage culturel, la Société française en transformation, co-authored with Sébastien Dubray, and the 2011 AUSC volume, Educating the Future Foreign Language Professoriate for the 21st Century, and co-authored with Hiram Maxim. Her current project is a book-length monograph on the use of design pedagogy for teaching second language writing, and if time permits, she might tell you a little bit more about it at the end. So now, without further ado, I will leave the floor to our presenter, whose webinar is entitled Re-Envisioning Writing Instruction Using a Design Approach. Heather, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Beatrice. It is a delight to give this webinar today. And I want to start by thanking all of you from so many places in the world for tuning in today, especially at the tail end of what's been for many of us, probably everyone here, a very challenging and different semester. So I really appreciate your willingness to give part of your Saturday, part of your weekend, to learning about design pedagogy. I want to start by just sharing a general overview of the organization of today's webinar. So in the first part of the webinar, I'm going to walk us through some of the challenges that have been discussed in the profession related to teaching and learning writing, and in particular, in environments where the language being taught is not one that is used in the community. So that will be how we start today. I'll give a little bit of information, a little bit of background research, and invite you to participate in the conversation via the chat. Next, I'll move on to sharing principles of what I call design writing pedagogy. This is not an approach that I have created myself, but it's inspired by several threads of education, new literacy studies research, and research from L2 writing. Then I will provide a detailed example of design writing pedagogy in a step-by-step model to show you what it looks like to use design writing in the classroom. And then I will conclude with a few thoughts about implementation of design writing pedagogy, what some of the challenges are, and then I'll point you to some reflection questions and some research some references that you might be able to use as a next step in exploring this pedagogical approach and thinking about how you might adapt it to your own needs. So I want to start with, well, let me take a second before we get into the research, but I wanted to start by sharing a little bit about my own background on teaching writing. I was not born a lover of teaching writing. In fact, after graduate school, the first time that I was asked to teach an advanced writing course by my department chair back in 2004 or 2005, I had a lot of hesitancy and even resistance to being the person charged with helping undergraduate French minors and majors learn to write. Myself, I had begun to study and learn French as a 19-year-old. So I brought a lot of linguistic insecurities to the table. I felt like I wasn't a master, I wasn't an authority on the linguistic system of French as a foreign language. And I felt that in my day-to-day research and reading that I wasn't doing a lot of writing in French myself. So I felt like I wasn't very qualified to teach French. So at that time, I was able to narrowly escape becoming a writing, a teacher of a writing course. But it caught back up to me again a couple of years later in my next position when I wasn't asked if I wanted to teach such a course. I was told I would be teaching one the next semester. So at that point, I really had no choice but to become curious about what would be the best way to engage my students in an advanced composition and grammar course. And that kind of began a journey that's now been 13 or 14 years in the making of being curious, reading about teaching writing, experiencing different approaches and playing with different approaches in the classroom. And that's brought me to where I am today. And over the past 2 or 3 years, beginning with a sabbatical semester, I started thinking about the theory and the practice of design writing. So I just wanted to mention that from the start, that I'm not an expert at teaching writing. I'm not an expert at writing myself. But I think with curiosity and the willingness to experiment, that we can all engage in different and innovative writing practices. What I found in the research as I started to read more about writing pedagogies in the teaching of foreign language, particularly in my own instructional context in the United States, is that there are a lot of challenges that are experienced not only by instructors, but also by students. I'm not alone in my quandaries and my confusion in teaching writing. And I want to start there with some of students' perceptions on teaching writing. There's been several survey studies that have been conducted over the last decade on how foreign language students perceive writing as a personal goal and also as an area of foreign language study. I have 2 that you see on the screen here. The first by Sally Magnan and her colleagues that looked at collegiate students, about 1,500 collegiate students in a variety of more and less commonly taught languages. And they showed that presentational writing in particular was not valued as much as a personal goal for those students as interpersonal communication, interpersonal writing, as well as interpretive communication. There's just one study out there by Michael Hubert from about 8 years ago that showed that collegiate students do hold positive feelings toward writing. He stated in his conclusion that they believe in the benefits of writing, but that was a different kind of study in so much that it looked only at writing and asked students, well, do you believe in its benefits? Yes or no. It didn't really ask about a constellation of other facets of language study. The other study that you see cited on the screen is by Nicole Mills and her colleague, who looked at Romance literature and language students at one selective Northeastern private institution and found that presentational writing held the lowest perceived value among 10 different areas of language study. So overall, I think that we can conclude from this that it's questionable how much value writing in a foreign language, and in particular presentational writing, holds for our students. I should also note, because I know those of you participating in this webinar today come from all different language teaching contexts, from kindergarten, preschool, graduate school, and in between. This research has focused on collegiate undergraduate students in the United States. So it's good to be able to contextualize that. So how do we, as a group of professors, those of us who are teaching foreign languages, and in particular in the United States, perceive the role of writing in our teaching? Well, as you see here, several studies, including one conducted by ACTFL in their Decade of Standards study in 2011, which included both K-12 and higher ed, language instructors, showed that presentational communication holds lower value than for teachers in terms of their instructional planning and the amount of time that they commit to it in the classroom than does interpersonal and presentational communication. And that was a pretty large study that included almost 1,300 language instructors. Mills and Moulton's article not only looked at the student side of things, but also at the professor side of things. And once again, they found that there was a gap in instructors' prioritization or perceived value of presentational writing in relation to interpersonal interpretive modes. The last study I wanted to bring up was done by Natalie Lefkowitz, and it included 14 instructors at the college level of both less and more commonly taught languages. And the participants in her study cited writing as students' weakest skill area. And half of her participants, so 7 out of the 14, also claimed that they felt not sufficiently prepared, that they had insufficient professional development experiences to help them know how to teach writing. So researchers have also hypothesized about the potential causes for these perceptions, for these reasons that as instructors we have misgivings and we may deprioritize the teaching of writing. For example, Schultz said, she mentioned lack of instructor confidence and their own writing ability, lack of knowledge about composition studies, so maybe knowing about how people are teaching writing in the first language, or knowing how people teach writing in English as a second or foreign language and how we might use that in other foreign languages. And they may feel doubt in their ability to teach their students to write well. I thought that was like a powerful statement that really spoke to me. In the study that I just cited earlier, Natalie Lefkowitz cited some of the instructional context elements that can influence how we feel about teaching writing, including things like oversized classes, heavy teaching loads, multiple preparations, budget cuts, understaffing, and limited time. I don't know if those things resonate with some of you, but from the looks of your registration materials and the questions that you answered and the information you provided, I think they just might. So I want to turn now to your own perceptions of teaching writing. And I have a question for you here that you see on the screen, and I'll invite you to respond via chat. What is your biggest challenge? So just one, the biggest one, the most, the one that recurs for you the most often in your teaching related to writing instruction. What is your biggest challenge?
So Heather, I'm going to be reading some of the things that are coming through the chat. Grading, time, getting students not to rely on Google Translate, lack of motivation, feedback, thinking in English, learner engagement, students not having enough ideas, literal translation, finding meaningful writing tasks, teaching learners to write without plagiarizing, how to draft meaningful essay questions, not having enough self-confidence to be able to do it, convincing students to have patience with their writing and expressing things with language they know, self-direction, lack of interest in writing, lack of reading, time again comes up, socio-pragmatic incompetence.
Great.
Yeah.
So I think that gives us a good idea of the variety and the direction of the challenges that you experience. And I'll take a couple more minutes now to look at the breakdown of your responses. These don't capture everyone's responses that are here today, but I looked at the first 332 registered participants who answered this question of your biggest challenges. And some of you gave more than one. So I did a bit of an analysis of these to see how they broke down. And your challenge is divided into two main categories, very logical, not very interesting, but student-related challenges on one hand and instructor-related challenges on the other. So above all other factors in relation to student challenges, you named engagement, motivation as the number one issue that you face in writing instruction. And I will read a couple of those responses now. For example, getting students to see the relevance and attempt to go beyond the bare minimum. It's frustrating for them when they can't communicate as much in their L2 as they can in their L1. So communicating and writing feels artificial for them. Right? And research has said over and over that particularly in foreign language learning environments where that language isn't used in the community, it's not clear for students and instructors alike what the purpose is for writing. Another response, students' time investment in the process of writing. Yet another, students just don't like writing, or I can't find great strategies to motivate them to do it. And then a last one in this category, my biggest challenge is to motivate my students to write as it is generally a neglected skill in my country. And the priority is generally given to grammar and vocabulary. And as you see on the screen, there's a number of other factors, non-affective or motivational factors that were mentioned in decreasing order after that of that motivation engagement. So the motivation engagement factor was mentioned by about 11% of those responses that I looked at. And next after that then was linguistic knowledge factors, as you see here, grammar, vocabulary, spelling and punctuation, cohesion and coherence. So lots of things related to how students navigate that linguistic aspect of writing tasks. And then coming to instructor factors, above all else was challenges in figuring out appropriate and effective pedagogical strategies and tools to use in the language classroom to engage students. And I'll read a couple of those. I also wanted to mention that the subset of these 41 pedagogy related responses that it was most commonly cited was that of differentiation. That differentiation is a huge challenge in writing in a foreign language. So to give an example, how to scaffold or differentiate for the different levels and funds of knowledge my students have individually. Another person wrote, planning the content to suit a heterogeneous group. Other pedagogical factors that were mentioned by you as a group were related to scaffolding, related to facilitating different stages of the writing process. And then a word that came up often was that of balance, balancing attention to different elements of writing instruction. For example, I'm hoping to find the right balance between writing practice and direct grammar instruction. And another person wrote, to keep a balance between accuracy and fluency. The second most common response in instructor factors was that of assessment. And within that category, many people mentioned the word feedback. For example, giving timely feedback, not overwhelming students with feedback. Or lastly, my correction of an essay takes so long because I'm writing a whole treatise to explain their mistakes. So giving timely and meaningful feedback seemed like it was a prevalent challenge among this group. And then finally, time constraints, which was something that came up often among the responses. So as your own quandaries with teaching writing attest, there are numerous unresolved questions in foreign language writing pedagogy. And I'll highlight several now that recur in the writing research, and I'll invite you to think with me together about some of these questions. So here's my first question for you. Why do students write in your courses? Why are you asking your students to write? And I'll give you a couple minutes, couple seconds to begin responding. And again, Beatrice will begin sharing some of your ideas. Why do you have students write in your language courses?
To help synthesize their thinking, to explain themselves, exam requirements. It is part of the critical thinking process, to master communication, to analyze a text, to explain their views, to reflect on cultural topic, to help meet presentational communication objectives, to communicate with others, native speakers or others, facilitate documentation. Writing is a way of communication in daily life, to focus on accuracy of language, to pass standardized tests, to create a product that they can be proud of, to reflect upon the discussions, a cultural event and reading they did, to learn genres such as business, letter, and other things.
Great. Thank you, Beatrice. So as you see, we have a wide variety of purposes of writing, and I love to see that many, even most of these are very purposeful, meaningful ways of using writing, which is great to see. So a quote from the research in relation to why students are writing and why this very question can be very problematic within foreign language writing contexts. Melinda Reichelt wrote, "Is the purpose of writing to work on accuracy and morphology, to practice structures, to provide experience and purpose of use of the language, to learn to create compositions, to learn and communicate about aspects of the language, including literature and culture, to support acquisition of speaking, reading, and listening skills?" And what is often the case, even within the same department and sometimes even within the same level in different teachers' classrooms, people, courses, curricula are using writing for different purposes and aims at different levels. And why that might not always be problematic, it can be challenging for students to navigate if the aims and purposes of writing are constantly shifting, right? So for example, if you're taking first and second year language courses, and the purpose of writing is primarily to practice orthography, morphology, syntactic structures, and perhaps you're writing short compositions, paragraphs, and then you jump into third year courses in cultural studies and literature, and suddenly you're anticipated to produce essays or analytic or persuasive work. That's a very, very different type of writing, and oftentimes students haven't been provided the basis for navigating those types of tasks. So a next question for you now. What elements of writing do you focus on during instruction? So what types of writing related activities do you do in your classroom? And in particular, I'm thinking about presentational writing. If you have a writing assignment that you give to your students, how do you support their preparation of that assignment, or navigating from pre-writing all the way through the finished product? What types of things do you do in your instruction? I'll give you a moment to respond via the chat.
So people are talking about using a mind map, brainstorming activities, free writing, providing graphic organizers, using a model, having them think about purpose and audience.
Great.
Give them some key vocabulary and expression during brainstorming, cohesion, peer feedback, journals, organizing of ideas, inverted pyramid model, allowing the use of Spanglish.
Yeah.
For
L1 to think about writing. Interesting.
Outlining and summarizing, free writing again.
Great. So lots of different ways to support the writing process. And I would say from the responses that Beatrice shared, a lot of pre-writing tools and activities. Nice. So historically, some of the elements of writing that have been emphasized in approaches that have been dominant, particularly in the North American context, have been linguistic accuracy as could be aligns best with what has been called product-based approach, sort of a traditional approach where students are assigned writing and the linguistic accuracy of the text is perhaps what's seen as the most important element, that they receive comprehensive correction or coding of their errors, and the evaluation of those written text is heavily weighted to linguistic accuracy. So that's one approach that's been dominant, product-based instruction, and continues in some circles to be practiced today. An approach that came to the forefront in the 1980s and is perhaps still the most dominant approach to teaching writing in foreign language contexts in the United States is that of process-based instruction. So that's really thinking about the cognitive aspects of writing and guiding or scaffolding that process from pre-writing, brainstorming, drafting, peer revision or peer review, and corrective feedback. That is an approach that has been widely, it's seen a lot of uptake in North American contexts, but research has also pointed out that only parts of process-based writing have been robustly practiced, and that some of the most important parts of this pedagogical approach have not in North America due to instructor resistance to activities such as peer review, particularly among students of limited linguistic proficiency. Finally, I want to mention genre-based instruction, a focus on the schematic aspects of writing, learning how to understanding and using the conventions that are associated with particular types of writing. What is interesting about these different approaches to writing and how they have been carried out often in the United States is they have been only partially instantiated, and they have been practiced in a rather isolated fashion, right? So whereas in ESL, EFL context, there's been a lot of talk over the last decade or more about post-process approaches, integrated approaches that don't just take one of these approaches, one of these focus areas of writing instruction, but the idea that perhaps it would be more powerful to combine approaches to give students a more thorough experience in learning to write in another language. So I'm going to turn now to this graphic by Ken Hyland about the different types of knowledge that are involved in writing. And the first time that I saw this, it really struck me that the different types of knowledge, the different types of information that we need to manipulate and that we need to juggle as we complete writing, and particularly presentational writing, are really complex. So he named at least 5 different types of knowledge that are involved in writing. And you can see how if you're focused, for example, primarily on the process, on those cognitive aspects of writing, or only on the genre and the use of model text, how you might miss some of the other elements that are in this graphic. So this makes the case that providing good writing instruction involves these multiple types of knowledge. It's not just about finding the right words or the right forms, punctuation, and spelling. It's not only about knowing how to approach the writing task. It's also about having good ideas and possessing awareness of your reader and audience and conventions that influence how the text is put together. So all of these forms, I would argue, along the lines of Ken Hyland's graphic here, that all these forms of knowledge are necessary if one subscribes to the view that writing is more than a collection of linguistic forms, if it's seen instead as discourse or using language in particular situations for specific purposes. So what type of pedagogical approach then would align with this idea that there's this multiplicity of knowledge types that we need to know how to use and adapt for our own purposes as writers? So I'm going to transition now to describing the elements of design pedagogy. I want to mention again that this notion of design is not one that I came up with myself. There's several decades of research and theorizing on the concept of design as part of new literacy studies. I'm making the case here, like many L2 writing theorists and practitioners, that no single theoretical perspective can provide all the answers for what we need to do in the writing classroom. And as Rick Kern wrote in 2000, an integrative student-centered approach that also attends to the interdependencies among textual products, cognitive processes, and sociocultural factors is what we need to work toward. So my proposal follows the same arguments of L2 scholars like Hyland, Raslitz, and Matsuda, who urge researchers and instructors to think beyond a single formula for teaching writing or a single theoretical perspective. So I want to start with what writing is, the act of writing is from a design perspective. So this orientation, what I call a design approach, integrates concepts from multiliteracies pedagogy and second language writing research. Whereas meaning design has been widely discussed as the central preoccupation of multiliteracies pedagogy, to date, design has not been posited as the framing concept for writing. This approach posits writing as a purposeful, collaborative act of communication that has three dimensions: linguistic, cognitive, and sociocultural, each of which should be addressed in the course of instruction. So in this regard, a design approach does not solely focus on the learner's individual writing process, nor does it privilege textual or sociocultural aspects of writing while leaving cognitive elements of writing untreated or underemphasized. So as Kern explained, this idea of design has to do with the conception, planning, and shaping of some artifact for some intended purpose. It focuses our attention on creative human processes and signifies the products of those processes. Design involves the interaction of material resources, social resources, and individual resources, and reciprocally produces new resources for future acts of design. I know this probably sounds abstract, but I'll try to make this more concrete through some examples soon. The thing I want to point out here is design is both a noun and a verb, right? It's both product, it's both the written text and the process. It's individual as well as social. So the elements of a design approach to teaching writing. You have these 5 elements here, and what I'm going to do next is talk through each of them, beginning with this idea of available designs as the starting point for the design writing process. Writing instruction should reflect an available designs focus. As we've already discussed, writing instruction has long privileged grammatical accuracy over other textual elements or aspects of the writing process, which is a situation that Natalie Lefkowitz stated, and I quote here, potentially interferes with sociolinguistic sensitivity, realistic expectations, and professional enjoyment by instructors. In a design approach, the resources needed to create text are viewed as multifaceted and include linguistic, schematic, visual, and spatial elements. So to make things a little bit more concrete, let's look at this text, which is an English language text. I haven't eaten lunch yet, so this makes me hungry. But I want to ask you for your ideas. What types of available designs do you see in this text? Do you observe in this text? And I'll let Beatrice share some of your ideas.
Picture. So there's a visual, a description, a combination of text and image, visual, linguistic, and spatial, step-by-step instruction, measurements, a specific context, different text features, summary at the top, instructions, what you expect to see in a recipe, command grammar structures, different formatting in the text, genre, experience with the object of writing, typography, visuals. There's also a clear organization of the document, typology, list, cultural context, personal opinion at the end.
Absolutely. Great. So you've identified, I think, all the different variety of available designs that coexist in this text. You have the linguistic content, right? And that's very, very important. But just as important for the meaning of this text are the spatial organization. We need to be able to pick out what is this recipe? Oh, it's Chipotle black bean tortilla soup. So we see that through a spatial available design. They're using a larger font. It's right at the top. We have that list of ingredients that combines numeric and linguistic information. And then you have the ever important list of steps in the recipe. And there's certain conventions, genre conventions of how those steps are communicated. And in some languages, you might use the infinitive to say things like preheat or make or prepare or mix or cut. Whereas in other languages, some languages might use the imperative and others might use the infinitive of the verb. It depends on the language. And those are types of conventions that learners are often completely ignorant of as they experience texts for the first time. You also have, as many of you mentioned, this visual text that brings meaning and works together kind of multimodally to give the reader an idea and to increase interest in the content of this recipe. So I just wanted to mention this as a way to think about the variety of available designs that coexist in text and how we often have a tendency to privilege the linguistic system of a text while ignoring or de-emphasizing other elements of design that are very, very meaningful. So next, I want to look at this process of what happens with available designs in the act of writing. And this is a graphic that comes from the Calansis, Cope, Daly, Trim book that came out a few years ago. We're going to share with you in a few moments a Google document where you have access to this citation. And in fact, online, there's a huge amount of free resources that you can access on the New Learning Online website, among them some of the chapters from this book. So what I want to point out here is that available designs are resources for meaning that learners possess both in their first language and in other language, and that these can be, these are used, adapted, and put to work in meaning making, whether it's writing or speaking or reading. So writing can be viewed as an act of design or meaning making, where these available designs are reconstructed for the purposes of representation and communication. And then the redesign, those are the written texts that are created through this design process. So a question from you now, and I know these are all new ideas, but I just want you to brainstorm with me. How does an available designs orientation, taking these ideas that we just talked about the multiplicity of meaning-making resources that exist in texts, how does this potentially shift then the focus of writing instruction? What will we be doing, or what will we be doing differently if we subscribe to this view of available designs and writing as an act of design? I'll give you a few seconds to think about this and to share via chat.
Someone says, look at the product first. It's a much broader scope. Writing becomes more creative. It opens up the realm of possibilities for writing task. It more tightly connects writing and thinking.
Okay.
Assessment changes, focus on communication versus accuracy. It makes it more relevant for students. It builds from students' previous knowledge. It opens the doors to multimodality. Start with authentic example text to analyze and then write. Gives a framework to approach the writing task. It helps with fluency. Well-organized instruction for student learners' view. It's more engaging and enhances as knowledge and experience. Gives a context and so on.
Great. And so I think these are a lot of compelling reasons, in fact, that this can be an interesting pedagogy to use with our students. It's not a pedagogy that says that linguistic available designs don't matter. They absolutely do. But it says, oh, there's other elements of design that are meaningful, that are important, and that are another way into the text. And that this, in fact, can be a more inclusive model for writing. Because what I've seen a lot, particularly with beginning level learners, is you see a lot of difference between those students maybe who are coming to, for example, the college classroom with several years of high school foreign language, but opt to enroll into the 100 level classes versus those who are taking it for the very first time. So as one participant mentioned, the funds of knowledge that students possess in relation to the second language can be very, very different, and can really privilege, in the end, those students who have longer trajectories of language study, or perhaps those students who are more familiar and more adept at manipulating the conventions of presentational writing in their first language or in their second language. So embracing this available designs perspective can not only give that a wider lens, but can also put people on a more even playing field in terms of building understanding and awareness of how texts are constructed. And of course, if this perspective is mirrored in our evaluation processes, then that can also be an empowering element. So I'm going to go on now to the second design element, intertextuality. And this is the idea that someone already mentioned a moment ago of beginning with a model or beginning with a model text. So starting with reading to write activities, we know that students can become very, very overwhelmed by that blank piece of paper or that blank screen, particularly with limited linguistic proficiency. It can be cognitively overwhelming. How do I organize my thoughts? And it can be linguistically overwhelming. Some of you mentioned in your responses to that registration question about your biggest challenges, hey, now that my students are learning remotely, I'm seeing a lot more use of online translation tools. And I think that oftentimes that's just because of the linguistic overload, right? Perhaps our students, aren't looking for shortcuts. They simply are cognitively and linguistically overwhelmed with that writing process, and if they're navigating it without a model. So beginning with reading to write activities can counteract in part this linguistic and cognitive overload. In addition, it can sensitize learners to the available designs, like the ones we've mentioned, that go beyond the linguistic element, like audience expectation, or genre conventions, spatial conventions as to how documents are organized, that also contribute to meaning making and text. The strategy, and here I'm mentioning a specific strategy related to intertextuality of textual borrowing, has been shown in research to be a helpful strategy to use in linking the reading and analysis of model texts with learners' writing of new texts, and can provide learners with new meaning-making resources. So that might be vocabulary, that might be expressions or chunks of language at the sentence level. And that might be at the discourse or the whole text level with things like genre conventions or organizational conventions, spatial available designs in the text. So here I'm going to give another example, and these are short texts from Facebook, from a Facebook group that has the aim of connecting people who are participating in Erasmus exchanges. So we use these short texts in our first year students' very first writing assignment in first semester French, in a chapter where they are learning to say who they are. They're talking about physical description and what they like. And rather than sending students home to write a composition about who they are and what they like, instead, we put them in this situation to take the perspective of someone who's looking for a roommate in one of these study abroad sojourns. So it really doesn't matter if you know a Romance language and you can read these texts. You can get an idea whether you can understand the linguistic available designs or not of the type of texts these are, the types of available designs that are included within each of these texts. And I wanted to ask you this question: how does beginning with analysis of model texts like this shift the focus of writing instruction? How is this different, and how might this facilitate the writing process if you think about this from the perspective of our students?
It gives context, more authentic. It seems more purposeful. It's writing within a discourse community. It's contextualized. They see meaning in the production. They discover the rhetoric organization of a text. Students have an understanding of what kind of language might be expected. It starts with reading. It focuses on the message, not on language. Raises awareness about the importance of audience. Increases metacognitive ability. You give more agency to beginners.
Great. Thank
and
you.
You might want to answer another question that was put in the Q&A about this. which was somebody was asking about what do you mean when you say reading to writing? And I think that might be a good opportunity to answer that.
Sure, right. So reading to write activities was something that I mentioned at the beginning of this slide, starting the process of writing instruction. In fact, not with writing, but reading and exploring model texts that are the same genre, the same text type as those that we're asking our learners to write themselves. So beginning with the reading, discussing, thinking about how the model text is constructed, what available designs are there, how is language used, before asking learners to write such a text themselves. I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I particularly appreciated lots of the responses that Beatrice shared here, that this is contextualized, this is meaningful, and this gives students an idea right away of how something like adjectives, descriptive content is used in real life communities where the language is spoken. It also shows multimodality at play. We have emoticons, we have numbers, we have images, visuals. So I think it's much richer to start with this reading to write orientation than simply saying, well, take your textbook, go home and write a little composition about yourself or your neighbor or your family. Can it, or I shouldn't say can it be, is it more challenging? Absolutely, because learners will be confronted immediately with language that's unfamiliar, that they don't see reflected in their textbook. But this is also a great opportunity to build reading strategies with students. Okay, the next design pedagogy element I want to talk about is multimodality. Writing instruction should integrate multimodality, or aligning language, writing in a foreign language to recommendations like those of the National Council of Teachers of English. And I quote here, to support students as they compose with a variety of modalities and technologies, including the incorporation of visual components and hyperlinks. And that's the end of the quote. So that's something that's one of the priorities for teachers of English in the United States in K-12, but it's not one that we hear about in terms of the standards of language learning here in the United States. A focus on multimodality can take many directions in teaching writing, as straightforward as analyzing how formatting conventions and visuals contribute to a text's meaning, or as creative as textual transformation from one modality to another. And that's referred to in the research literature as mode shifting. And that's something that I've played with in my instruction in recent years, and I've found to be a very facilitative form of linking, for example, presentational writing and presentational speaking. Multimodality is yet another element that helps learners to see that effective writing is not limited to finding the right words or grammatically correct structures, but instead it results from weaving together appropriate and interesting linguistic and non-linguistic available designs in texts. I'm going to go on now to the third design element, perspective taking. Perspective taking relates to the particular advantage of writing in comparison to many forms of language, and in particular oral language. And Kern described this advantage of writing, or one of the affordances of writing, and I'm quoting his 2000 book, Language and Literacy Teaching here. Writing allows learners' language use to go beyond functional communication, making it possible to create imagined worlds of their own design. I don't know why, but this imagined worlds of their own design makes me smile every time I read that. Whereas writing in lower level language courses tends to be very learner oriented. So describe your routine, recount a memorable vacation, tell about a favorite meal. By incorporating perspective taking in writing and shifting learners' point of view at various levels of language and meaning from the start, awareness can be gained of new language, culture, and context-specific meanings. And this is an idea that Erin Carney has written about in her book on intercultural competence, and one that really resonates with me as a valuable part of writing instruction. This can allow learners to play with new available designs and to participate in creative invention or trying on of new identities. Although perspective taking has been taken up by researchers primarily in relation to project-based learning and global simulation, I feel that it has a lot of potential to inform writing instruction and should be further explored. Perspective taking could prove to be a valuable means of increasing learner motivation and engagement with the written presentational mode. The final component of design writing is collaboration, or facilitating a writing cycle in which social interaction, both between learner and instructor and among learners, facilitates the development of a writing community. This can take on various forms, including pre-writing, which has been mentioned by many of you already. And that can play out in a way where learners are working together in small groups to think about either analysis of a model text or brainstorming ideas to write new texts. Or other forms such as individual writing conferences between learners and instructors, peer feedback sessions, text read-alouds or recorded read-alouds of text. I'm thinking now of those of us who are teaching in remote instruction, as well as self-reflection by individual learners on writing. All of these activities reinforce the dialogical or social nature of writing and represent a possible way of positively influencing learners' affective or motivational concerns related to writing. I know that in my own teaching of writing courses, and right now I'm teaching a 5th semester French language course, when you read your students' self-reflections on writing, you really gain a different dimension beyond seeing the product of their writing. But when they talk to you in their own words about maybe the struggles they went through or something that they're satisfied with or proud of in their writing, you get a much fuller view of what went into that product of the writing process. And it can help you to establish more of a dialogue with your students about what's going well in their writing and what they're struggling with, to know where they're at with their writing process. So in summary, the 5 principles of design writing are shown here. And I also included the summary on the Google document that you will have access to. So again, to repeat, available designs are the first design writing element. Intertextuality is the second. Multimodality is the third. Perspective taking is the fourth. And the last is collaboration. So I'm going to pause now to find out what questions you might have about design writing pedagogy. If there's anything that's really standing out as a question, something that might be a point of confusion for you.
Okay, so we have actually 5 questions, Heather, in the Q&A.
Okay.
And the first one by Lily. She's asking, does the design approach increase the recursiveness of the writing process? And if yes, in what ways?
Okay, absolutely. Well, I would say that in several ways, you can think of recursiveness between model text and students' text, and you can also think about it in relation to the process itself. design writing pedagogy very much aligns with the notion that students should have multiple passes, multiple attempts to elaborate their writing, to hear about others' reactions to their writing, whether it's peers or their instructor, and to refine, revise, and then finally publish final versions of their writing. So in a nutshell, absolutely, this approach subscribes to the idea of writing as a recursive process.
Laura is asking, does this approach emphasize writing to learn or learning to write activities?
I love this question. So this is this traditional dichotomy that has been written about a lot in the writing literature. And in the handout, Laura, this is something that I discussed in my 2018 article in Foreign Language Annals at some length. So learning to write is the notion that we emphasize explicit writing instruction, writing for the sake of writing, writing for the sake of meaningful, purposive genre, or writing for particular purposes. That's the learning to write orientation. Writing to learn is that notion of using the modality or skill of writing to do something else. Traditionally, that's been instantiated as writing to learn grammar, writing to practice vocabulary. But I would say that design writing does both. I think it would be more on the side of learning to write, but it also embodies this idea of writing to explore culture, writing as play, writing as creativity. So it doesn't really go in the direction of the primary purpose for writing to be practicing linguistic structures, but I do think it's a combination of the two if we're able to redefine that notion of writing to learn.
Another person is asking, how can the design approach be implemented in large classes?
That's a really good question, and I'm not sure how large is large, but I would say if you're interested in exploring this in large classes, take it slow. Start with small steps. For example, in college level courses that I coordinate and work with teaching assistants, some of those classes have 25, 26, 27 students in them. We're only going through the full cycle of design writing twice during the semester, right? Sometimes I've had the good fortune to teach classes as small as 10 or 15 upper levels students where our only focus is writing because it's a writing class. Really think about what is the aim of your class, what are the different learning outcomes that you're targeting in that course, and how much time and effort can I expend on a design writing process and giving students feedback on design writing. It might just be a couple of times during the term, and you might not be able to play out each and every element of the design process to its fullest every time, and that's okay, right?
Would you do the reading to writing preparation in the target language or the native language?
That's a great question. Yeah. So when you're doing analysis of model texts and thinking about what available designs, what genre conventions are there, when very much level dependent, right? Very much dependent on your students' literacy skills that exist in the foreign or second language. But I would say at least part of that should occur in the target language, the foreign or second language. I know that when we do this in our elementary level or first year college courses and we do writing workshops, day one is always dedicated to model text analysis. And we definitely bring in limited amounts use of the first language as we start to work on textual borrowing activities and thinking about, oh, there's these expressions in the model text that means this in the first language. But I do think you have to be careful and ask yourself, who is your audience? Is the L1 going to be facilitative for everyone in the class? I know in my current class, I have, I don't know, maybe 30% of my students, maybe more, who don't speak English at home as their first language. So it's not always facilitative, but it can have a helpful role if it's at play with those cognitive processes and students trying to make connections, in particular with lexical resources, with vocabulary.
One more question. There are many more, but we'll leave them for a little later.
Sure.
How could this approach be used in more advanced writing tasks? For example, introduction to literary analysis.
Absolutely. And I will be coming to this. I might defer that
Just
for
keep it in mind then.
I'm going to keep that in mind, but it's an approach that I have used in 300 and 400 level undergraduate classes and working with many different genres of literary texts, as well as cultural studies classes where we worked on different forms of persuasive or discussion-oriented texts.
Thank you, Heather. So maybe we can continue with the presentation.
Great. So I want to take a quick moment, I'm mindful of time, but to ask you, which out of these 5 design elements that I've discussed would you be curious to integrate or integrate more robustly? Maybe you already have started integrating it into your writing instruction. Is there something new? Is there something intriguing for you that this presentation has made you think, I want to explore that and try that out in my writing?
Multimodality.
Mm-hmm.
Perspective taking. Perspective taking is new to me. Available design. Multimodality is coming up again and again.
Multimodality. Yeah.
Collaboration. Intertextuality.
Great.
Collaboration between students.
Excellent.
So I think, multimodality, perspective taking, collaborations are the 3 that are coming up again and again right now.
Great. And when you get a chance to look through that Google document, you will note on the last page of it that there are references, and I've kind of tagged the references for what the focus of the different publications are, the ones that I've worked on. And there's at least one that focuses on multimodality and perspective taking. All right, so I want to come now to a design writing example. I'm going to walk us through one specific example, but this is a list of some of the various types of design writing, presentational writing, assignments or tasks that we have worked on in my home institution curriculum. We're working with collegiate students. And so when I say year 1, I mean 100 level or elementary level college foreign language courses, year 2 being intermediate, and then year 3+ would be those upper level cultural studies, literature, or advanced writing courses. I've tried to indicate on the slide where I've done previous publications that walk you through the different design writing examples, since it's not feasible for our time today to work through several of these, but you have all the details of particularly the ones in year 3+ and some of my previous materials, and full text free download is available in all of those except for the last one, which will be coming out this winter in Calico Journal. And that one's on multimodality and creating personal narrative podcasts. That's one of my most recent projects. All right, so the design writing example I want to share with you is one that we have used in my home institution with first semester French students. The students are nearing the end of the semester and they are working in a unit that talks about personal interests, seasons, weather, pastimes. So, okay, so if you look on page 3, you have a full narrative of how this design writing sequence of activities plays out. And the model text, you see just the beginning section of it here. It's called Let's Travel with Mathilde to Gatineau. Okay, so this is about, this is written by a young Canadian woman who lives in Gatineau, and she is serving as like a local travel guide to her city. So stage one, rather than starting by asking students, write a composition about your hometown, what you like to do there, we start with looking at the Let's Travel With website. Not the text, not the model text itself, but here we're just setting the stage and helping students to learn about the context of that written, of the writing, right? So what is surrounding that text culturally, or in terms of audience and aim? So we look at the Let's Travel With website homepage and think about, based on who we see there, what we see there, how language is being used, who might the audience be? Looks like young people, right? And thinking about what types of available designs we see there. So you see on the screen now one of the images from social media that existed at the time in relation to this website. And you can see, hashtag Let's Travel With, etc. In stage two, now we arrive at those reading to write activities through analysis of the model text. So students engage in this reading to write textual analysis in the classroom, both individually, with activities that ask them to think about what are the main ideas of this text. How is this text organized? Oh, okay, it's a question and answer back and forth. So we have an interview with Mathilde about her city. How do the images and the text fit together? So we're starting to have them think about what type of content and what type of available designs are featured in this text. Next, still using the model text in part, we have learners engage in pre-writing and in particular textual borrowing activities. So one thing that we do in this stage is asking students, so what kind of person do you think Mathilde is, and how do you think she's attempting to portray her city? What is she emphasizing and what is she not emphasizing? Oh, she seems outdoorsy. There's a lot of outdoor destinations that are featured. Oh, there's a lot of food. But how do you then, starting to think about as pre-writing of your text, how do you want to portray your hometown? What's your take on it going to be? What perspective do you want to infuse into your text? And I know some people, so I live in Madison, Wisconsin. Some students have taken the perspective of like sports fans. So Madison for sports fans, or foodie Madison, that more, Midwestern farm to table. But to think about having an angle, having a perspective, and embracing that identity as a hometown reporter, but thinking about constructing a text that just doesn't, oh, well, here's everything you see on TripAdvisor and all the must-dos of my city. Well, how do you want to portray it? So that adds a layer of interest and engagement, I think, for students, particularly when you have, let's say you're working with high school students and they're all going to write about the same hometown. Well, that might not be so interesting for peer review. But then again, if you reframe it as, we're going to have some people talk about outdoorsy, I don't know, Boise, and then foodie Boise, and then some other, interests that someone might have, music in the class, that makes it a lot more interesting as a product of collaboration to discuss together. Students in the stage also identify model text resources to use and or adapt in their own writing. So what students will quickly see is, oh, there's useful vocabulary here, or maybe we have some chunks of language at the sentence level, but I'm going to need to make some modifications for my own text. So what will those be? How will I make them? So we start taking some notes and writing in class, just at like the word or expression level, to start that brainstorming process, as well as starting to think about vocabulary that's pertinent to learners' own focus in their text. So that might be using physical dictionaries or wordreference.com or whatever dictionary is a good online resource in the language that you teach, but using that moment in the classroom to start to teach responsible use of online tools that can be facilitative for finding textual content. The next stage then would be having students draft a text, turn in that draft, and also perhaps in the spirit of this design element of collaboration, a short reflection on it. Maybe a couple prompts along the lines of, what are you satisfied with in this first draft? What are you not satisfied with? What questions do you have for your teacher about the work you turned in? So that would be then the next stage. And then finally, moving to collaboration and feedback. This obviously depends on the space you have in your curriculum and in your instruction for it. It can really expand to take on a very prevalent dimension, like when I teach creative writing, or you can kind of streamline this and simply provide feedback one-on-one to students in writing or recorded audio comments. And then that last step being having students revise their texts and publish their texts in some way. I've listed here the evaluation criteria. These are not prescriptive, but when we have done this writing assignment, these are the evaluation criteria that we've used. Our task completion, I want to mention this is very important, is not simply turning in the assignment, but is, have you turned in your draft of the assignment? Have you turned in your pre-writing activities? And this is one that we find is very, very useful for preventing plagiarism, because if students are turning in their pre-writing activities, they're showing us the process in part of how they built up to producing a draft. So we have students turn in their draft electronically, turn in their pre-writing activities, and then turn in a short reflection on their work. So all of those elements would go into the evaluation of task completion. Then lexicogrammatical comprehensibility and use of target structures, so those structures we've been teaching during the semester. And then finally, effectiveness in conveying message. And we have very specific language for each of our writing tasks as to what that means. What particularly does that mean depends on the task. But this is where we get at and give students credit for using appropriate available designs that go beyond language, that go beyond vocabulary and grammar. Perhaps it's constructing a text that involves an image, heading levels, other types of available design, but we don't just want the text to be accurate linguistically, we want it to be effective in its presentation. Okay, so I've included for you in your handout a summary of the design writing stages that I just walked us through. So next steps for you at home after you've learned some today about design writing pedagogy. I wanted to mention that there's a set of guided reflection questions in the Google document. So you might just be at capacity today for new ideas, set it aside and come back to those reflection questions later. I think that they work particularly well if you have a specific course in mind, right? Maybe you're teaching French 2 at your high school. Maybe you're teaching a composition course for the first time at your college. But take your syllabus and take what you know and what you've done in your course before, and think about that course in relation to these guided reflection questions. And then finally, I wanted to mention that there's a list of select references that I've mentioned in today's webinar that are included in the final page of the Google Doc. And whenever possible, I included a link to the full text download for free for your use. That is the end of my presentation. Thank you to all of you for participating today, for the great ideas that you shared. And feel free to reach out to me as well. I've included my email address on the screen and on the handout. And I would love to dialogue with any of you about design writing pedagogy.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Heather. That prompts us to re-examine how we approach writing in the foreign language classroom, really. A lot of people have questions about assessment. And I saw also a question about this in the chat where someone was saying, I'm wondering if anyone here has sample rubrics that could use that they could use for multiple stage writing process, because we need to keep the grading efficient for TAs.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I would say the number one place to go with that is with thinking about how you give feedback in relation to vocabulary and grammar, because, and this is something that I still struggle with, and I struggle with in working with TAs who have limited time and who are balancing responsibilities as teachers and scholars, right? And the idea of focusing on targeted structures, I think, can be very useful. Maybe asking, instead of comprehensive line by line correction or coding of errors, to only focus on targeted structures, those that you've been working on in instruction and that you explicitly point out to the students as things that they need to use in their writing. That alone, I think, can help you to balance your time in giving feedback and focusing on content versus the linguistic elements of the text. I do have some sample rubrics. Maybe what I'll do is I can go back to the Google Doc and add those to the end of the Google Doc. One thing that I recommend that I've experimented with in recent years that's been very, very helpful is to include as an evaluation criteria, and this I've done particularly at the advanced level with students who are enrolled in my writing classes, include learner engagement and interaction in the process as one of the evaluation criteria on their work. So it's about both process and product, right? Did you engage in your peer review fully? Did you fill out the peer review documents? What was the quality of the feedback that you gave to your peer? This past summer, I taught a mainly asynchronous creative writing and French course for the first time during COVID times. And I found that digital tools were very helpful for this.
Thank you. Someone is asking, should grammar corrections be limited to targeted recently taught structures?
I mean, this is a controversial question. I don't want to give a definitive answer, but the research does not support the notion that comprehensive grammar correction results in learner uptake of accurate forms. It's something that's perhaps disheartening or perhaps liberating for us as instructors.
Somebody else is asking, how do you teach students the meta language that they need?
That's a great question. So I think the advice I would give is not to make assumptions, to try to find out from your learners from the beginning of your course what they know and don't know. Maybe they don't know the parts of speech. Or something that I found out in my creative writing class is that my students were not aware of the meta language of rhetorical devices. But you can find out things like that by giving them a no stakes quiz, right? Or an activity where you find out, okay, hey, what is a metaphor? Can you define it or give an example? What's the difference between an adjective and an adverb? But I try to do those things in a low stakes, no stakes way. That becomes a source of information for me for what they've learned at previous educational levels or in their first language classes and what we need to do in the classroom. So I think it's important to establish that meta language, but also to find out what available designs they possess when they come into your classroom, because we often assume that they have greater control over that meta language than they do.
Thank you. Sabine is asking, what would you suggest as a model when asking students at a higher level to write an opinion piece on the content of the course without limiting the creative personal interest in how students want to write?
Okay, can you repeat that one more time? I think
Sure.
I have
A
an
long
idea. It would be
question.
helpful.
What would you suggest as a model when asking students at a higher level to write an opinion piece on the content of the course without limiting the creative personal interest in how students want to write?
Yeah, my first thought is, Sabine, you might want to read in particular my 2018 article that I wrote with Lauren Goodspeed that appeared in L2 Journal. It's a free download. And we worked particularly on an opinion piece there in a cultural studies advanced class. And my first idea that came to mind as I heard Beatrice read your question, thank you for this question, very interesting question, is that I've heard genre writing scholars talk about you have to know how genre conventions work and what the sort of limits of them are to be able to break those conventions. So kind of working to sensitize your students to what conventions must be respected in a text in order to be comprehensible and to be perceived as appropriate, and where there's room for individual agency, right? If you come back to a recipe text, there's certain things that you have to respect and you have to have in a recipe text for the reader to understand the textual content. And then there's areas where you can play, right? There's, in genre theory, they talk about textual moves as required moves and optional moves. So that might be a concept, Sabine, you might look into, or feel free to email me for follow-up. Sensitizing students to what those required elements, the required content or available designs of text, and which ones are optional.
There were also a few questions about academic writing. And because I think maybe a lot of the examples were targeting lower levels of instruction. Yeah. So some of the questions are asking, how do you use this approach to teach academic writing?
Absolutely. And I think textual models would be the first place that I would start to answer that question. Finding whether you're talking about academic writing that might be, in French, we have explication de texte. What's the translation of that in English, Beatrice?
I have no idea.
It's a French specialization,
it's a French thing, so I don't know.
Close reading, close analysis.
Yeah, close analysis, yeah.
That's one that's very prominent in upper levels of French. You could think about business correspondence, right? But start with textual models. And sometimes you're not able to find a textual model that will both reflect the content focus and the very, very specific subgenre. But for example, you might go to editorials while you're doing a related type of persuasive writing in an upper level course, or you might go to an academic article that's highly descriptive in part of the article to provide a model for students for how to do a descriptive or an expository text. But I think it's the same approach. It's just different types of textual models that you start from. And sometimes you have to have a bit more of a wide lens in thinking outside the box a bit to find textual models. I don't know, Beatrice, do you have any other ideas? That's a
really good question. I don't know. I really don't know. I think the idea of starting, maybe, sample text, maybe with different audiences in mind.
Right,
so,
right.
I'm thinking about,
journalistic tags.
Exactly. And what kind of language might be used. So you could look at, different kinds of newspapers, some that are, you could look
intellect highbrow versus
daily.
daily.
And just see how a particular topic is handled differently. I mean, the type of language and how it's being presented might be useful. Yeah.
That's a great idea to sort of have numerous model texts and to think about it in a intertextual way. Well, what linguistic, available designs are constant across these, and then how are there differences in these different subgenres?
Yeah, and then going back, if it's a journalistic piece, right, looking at the kind of images or type font they're using,
Sure.
depending on the kind of newspapers, for example, or magazines we're looking at. So thank you. Somebody is asking, how long does the process from beginning to end actually
Yeah.
last?
Great question. So in the example that I gave, that process plays out in the classroom over at least 100 minutes. So the stage 1 and stage 2 activities, when we do them at the college level for that task, take 50 minutes for introduction to the website and the model text analysis, and then another 50 minutes for stage 2, thinking about brainstorming, pre-writing, textual borrowing. If you want to then add on a layer of in-class peer feedback, peer review type activities, I would then add on at least another half an hour to that. But you can also do those as homework activities, outside class activities, depending on the level of the learner and how much scaffolding of that process. On the other hand, sky's the limit. If you're doing something like a writing class, when I walk through that process in my upper level creative writing class, it can take upwards of a week, between a week and 2 weeks, if I have a class where my targeted learning outcomes are more narrow and more focused on only the writing process.
Thank you. I think that's an important question, just to make the distinction. Somebody is asking, if the design approach starts with a model text, how is it different from the product approach to writing?
Very interesting, right? So typically in a traditional approach, a product approach, students are not provided models as a way, typically. I'm not an advocate or a practitioner, nor have I been of product-based writing, but I think I've participated in product-based writing as a student growing up. I feel like when you're given models in that approach, that it's of accuracy more than anything else. This is what an accurate text looks like. And it's primarily focused on the linguistic available designs. Whereas in a design approach, that model text is being used as a way to sensitize learners to that multiplicity of available designs. And through pre-writing activities, we're asking learners to kind of mediate between their own agency and the conventions of that model text, and to find some textual resources that they can use or adapt for their own purposes. But the text, I see it as more one-dimensional in a product-based approach. Personally, when I was growing up, I was never provided model text in a product-based approach. Maybe I was shown something that like a previous student in the class in a previous semester had produced, and sort of like, here, this is a work, right? This is sophisticated linguistic expression. But in a design approach, I think it's a more robust and a more multi-dimensional use of model text.
Somebody is asking, and that might be an important question actually. How do we ensure that students have improved their meaning-making resources in this approach? What becomes the focus of the instructor in this approach? So I think there's a shift about what the instructor does. I think that's what it's
Right, and this can be something that can be a concern if we advocate and use model texts. Are these just recipes, right? Are students just copying and sort of like copy pasting in a few words of their own? So I think one important note is that, for example, when we do the task, the writing task that I presented as the exam, as the model, We ask students when they turn in their draft to digitally highlight what words or spatial conventions, what have you adapted or used from the model text, and what language is your own. So you can kind of visually, as the teacher, see on the screen, and you could do this with a highlighter in person, you can do this with Microsoft Word. What is the model text language and what is your own language? And to come back to something I mentioned before, the evaluative criteria in design writing are multiple, and it balances attention to linguistic accuracy as well as the effectiveness of the text and task completion, right? So you might have a learner who, you evaluate that the accuracy of their text and the use of targeted structures is very, very strong, but maybe their text is really bland and maybe they didn't include visuals, or it's not organized as effectively as it should be for the reader. So I think it's important to use, as someone asked about before, rubrics, whether they're holistic or analytic, that they give learners detailed feedback about what aspects of design writing they're performing strongly in or less strongly.
Thank you. We still have a lot of questions. I think, just one brief one, something, but that's something that you might want to add to the Google Docs. Somebody is saying, let me see. Somebody says, I remember you mentioned the benefits of some online tools in facilitating the writing process and student engagement. Would you give us some examples of these tools? And maybe that's something that could be added to the Google Doc.
Sure. Okay, right. So some resources on teaching foreign language writing, thinking about engagement across languages. Okay,
yeah.
Sure.
I think I'm going to have to stop here. We're already almost 20 minutes beyond our time.
I didn't even notice. It went quickly.
Yeah, it's just, so I think maybe some of you, please don't feel disappointed by not me taking on all your questions. Feel free to email Heather. And, she'll be happy to get back to you on this.
Yeah, please do. I appreciate everyone's time for staying over. For those of you who stayed through the Q&A, I wish you all the best in exploring design pedagogy. And once again, the invitation is open to correspond with me about design writing at any point.
But overall, everyone is, and if you look at the chat, you have many.
I haven't looked at the chat once.
Thank yous. And people did find the presentation really useful and will be using some of that information in their courses. So
I appreciate it, everyone.
Thank you so much.